when you're desperate to leave the one place that's crushed you, and the only thing you love more than your freedom is a child you must protect. You will lie, even in your letters, even to a stranger you might have to marry. Leora asked him in the second letter, "Would you be open to a child someday?" Baron Rhys Ashbourne wrote back, "No. Children are messy, loud. I've no use for them." So she stopped writing the truth. She told him what he wanted to hear. She told him she was alone, because sometimes a lie is the only door that doesn't shut in your face. The prairie had no mercy for the weak. It stretched like the bones of a dead god, dry and sprawling beneath a sky that never blinked. The wagon rocked through the last bend of the trail as wind rolled off the hills, stirring the dust like old ghosts. Leora Bellamy sat tall, though her back ached and her nerves were splintered thin. Her hands rested on her lap, steady only by force of will. In the trunk behind her, beneath a folded quilt and 2 layers of linen, a secret breathed gently in the dark. 6 years old, hazel-eyed, born of love and abandonment. The child's name was Letty, and Leora had no right to bring her here, but she'd had no right to stay where they were either. Ashbourne Ranch rose from the land like a judgment. 3 stories of stone steeped in silence, with tall windows that didn't seem to open. It was the kind of place where echoes lived longer than people. The wagon pulled up to the steps, its creaking wheels faltering as if they too were uncertain. Leora climbed down slowly. Her boots crunched on gravel. Her fingers tightened on her valise. The man on the porch did not rise to greet her. Baron Rhys Ashbourne stood with a posture carved from granite. Tall, thin-hipped, dressed in black with only the barest flash of silver at his collar. His auburn hair was tied back, his jaw square, his eyes so pale they looked like they'd been washed out by snow. He did not smile. "You're early," he said. "By a few hours, sir." A slow nod. He stepped down from the porch, not rushed, not stiff, but precise. Everything about him was precise. "This house is not a place for dramatics or whims," he said. "I expect a wife who can keep to herself, maintain order, and, should the need arise, attend to my care. Do you understand?" Leora nodded. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't like noise," he added, softer. "I don't like clutter, and I especially don't like surprises." She could feel the lie pulsing in her throat, the lie she had built a life upon. "No surprises," she said. The Baron's eyes lingered another second, then he turned. "This way." The housekeeper met her inside the door. Mrs. Eunice Talbot was already waiting, small, gray, and sharp as a nail. She didn't smile, but she didn't sneer either, just took the valise and turned on her heel. "Quarters are upstairs. Follow me." As they climbed, Leora counted the creaks in the staircase. 1, 2, 3. At the 4th, her thoughts snapped to the trunk still tied to the back of the wagon. Her heart climbed into her throat. "May I?" she started, then caught herself. Mrs. Talbot glanced over her shoulder. "What is it?" I left a package in the wagon. May I retrieve it?" The housekeeper gave a grunt that could have meant anything and waved her off. Leora waited until nightfall. She snuck out under the hush of a waxing moon. Her boots barely whispered in the grass. The trunk was right where she'd left it, covered with a tarp, one rope fraying at the edge. She untied it slowly. Inside, Letty blinked up at her, flushed, drowsy, but calm. The lid hadn't been closed all the way. A strip of cloth had wedged the edge open just enough for light and air to pass. The trunk itself had tiny holes in the side ironwork, meant for drainage once, but now serving another purpose. A small flask sat beside her, nearly empty. The biscuit Leora had packed lay untouched, wrapped in a napkin. "I didn't cough," the little girl whispered. "I know," Leora whispered back. "You're very brave." "I kept counting seams, so I wouldn't fall asleep too deep." Leora's chest ached. She pressed a kiss to her daughter's temple. "You did everything right. I'm here now." She carried her daughter not to her room, but to a place she'd discovered during the house tour, a narrow door behind the linen closet in the servants' wing. It opened into a crawl space full of cobwebs and forgotten dust. A perfect place for secrets. Inside, she'd already placed a cot, a lantern, and another flask of water. Letty settled into the bed without a word. "We'll tell him," Leora promised, brushing her daughter's hair. "Just not yet." Letty nodded, then turned to the wall, small and still as breath. Mrs. Talbot watched her work, watched her hands tremble when the floor creaked, watched the way she flinched at raised voices and how her eyes darted to the shadows like a hunted thing. "Who was he?" the housekeeper asked one afternoon. Leora didn't look up. Mrs. Talbot didn't repeat it, just handed her a clean rag and said, "Put a quilt under the attic window. It'll chill your bones otherwise." It was the first soft thing anyone had said to her in months. The child was discovered by accident. 5 days into her stay, a thunderstorm tore across the plains. Windows rattled, horses screamed. The house itself seemed to groan with memory. Leora was in the kitchen with Mrs. Talbot when she heard it, a cry, faint, high, unmistakably human. "What in heaven was that?" the old woman snapped, reaching for a lantern. "Just wind," Leora said too fast. Mrs. Talbot squinted. "That didn't sound like wind." She started down the hall. Leora followed, heart in her throat. The lantern flickered. The house creaked. Mrs. Talbot reached the linen closet and paused. She pressed her hand against the wood panel, gave it a push. It groaned open. Inside, a pair of hazel eyes stared up at her from the cot. "Mama?" Letty whispered. The silence that followed was longer than the storm. Then Mrs. Talbot exhaled, set the lantern down, and knelt beside the girl. "Well," she said, "you've got her eyes. That'll be trouble." By dawn, a new secret had taken root. Mrs. Talbot said nothing to the Baron. Not yet. "Men like him," she muttered over tea, "don't take kindly to being misled. But I knew his mother, and she'd have liked your girl." Leora didn't speak. She just reached for her daughter's braid and held it. She didn't know how long this borrowed peace would last, only that it was worth every lie she'd ever told. Then came the moment she feared most. She was in the greenhouse, trimming dead stems, when he found her. Baron Ashbourne stood in the doorway, holding something between his fingers. A drawing, crayon on paper. A house, a sun, a stick figure with a braid. "She left it on my desk," he said quietly. Leora froze. "I don't like surprises," he said again. She turned. "I tried to tell you in the letters. You didn't. You wouldn't have answered if I had." He didn't deny it. "She's mine," Leora said. "I had no choice." He stared at the drawing a moment longer, then dropped it gently on the soil and walked away. And just when she thought it was over, she heard a small voice behind her. "Mama?" Leora turned, breath caught in her throat. There, barefoot on the stone, Letty stood in her nightdress, hair mussed and clutching her doll by the neck. The storm had woken her. Or maybe the silence had. Rhys looked at her, not the child, her, and in that glance, there was something hard, like a judgment passed, but underneath it, something else flickered. A question he didn't want to ask, a memory he hadn't meant to find. Letty's eyes darted to the drawing on the ground, then back to her mother. Leora moved quickly. "It's all right, sweetheart. Go on now, back to your little room." Letty didn't move. She looked up at the tall man in black, uncertain, curious. "Go on," Leora said, softer this time. "I'll be right behind." After a long moment, the girl turned and padded back down the hallway. Her footsteps were so light they sounded like they might never land. Rhys didn't speak, not at first. "I don't like being lied to," he said finally, his voice low and taut. "I've said it more than once." "I remember," Leora replied. "I gave you a home, I gave you safety, and you brought a child into it without my knowledge. I brought a child into it because I had no other choice." He turned to her. "There's always a choice." She took a step forward. "Number there's not. Not when you're a woman alone with a baby and no coin. Not when your name has been ruined and your body is still bleeding from the man who left you. The letters were my only door out, and I walked through it with a lie. Because I had to." Rhys stared at her, jaw tight, eyes colder than the air before frost. She lowered her voice. "You said you didn't want children. I was going to lose everything if I told you. I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to understand." "I understand," he said flatly. "You made your decision, and now I'll make mine." Then he turned and walked away. He didn't slam the door. That would have been easier. He just disappeared. Leora stood among the roses, the drawing still at her feet, petals falling in the wind. For 2 days, Rhys Ashbourne said nothing to her, not a word, not a glance that lasted more than a second. But he didn't send her away, and that, more than anything, frightened her. Because silence could mean many things, and in a house this large, silence could become a noose if you weren't careful where you stepped. Mrs. Talbot kept her own counsel. "Give him time," she said while sweeping ash from the stove. "He's got more scars than skin, that one. Some men take longer to bleed." Leora nodded, but the waiting felt like drowning with her feet chained to hope and her lungs full of guilt. She kept Letty hidden still, though the old woman had begun letting the child sit quietly by the kitchen fire in the early mornings, just until the Baron was out riding. Letty helped stir the porridge, fed the cat with both hands, and asked her tiny questions in a whisper too soft for ghosts to hear. One of those mornings, Leora found something strange by the door, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied carefully with twine. Inside was a child's book of stories, its corners worn down and its pages mended with thread. There was no note, no name, just a quiet offering placed in the early hours like a truce between strangers. Leora said nothing, but she knew exactly who had placed it there. That night, Rhys sat at his desk, a leather-bound ledger open in front of him but untouched, his pen dry, his fingers stiff with restraint. He stared at the flickering lamp with a jaw tight enough to crack. There were things he didn't want to feel, memories he'd buried under disciplined distance, and the endless rhythm of cattle and frost and silence. But that child's voice, that quiet whisper in the greenhouse, had struck something he thought long dead. It wasn't affection. Not yet. It was memory. A crib once built in the upstairs room. A woman who had once laid her hand gently on his chest and said, "He'll have your eyes." That child hadn't lived, and the woman had not stayed. He still remembered the look she gave him before the door shut behind her. "You don't know how to be loved," she had said, "and you never will." He had not cried when she left, not then, not in the months after, but he hadn't married since either. Not until Leora, not until the lie, not until the girl with her mother's eyes came walking into his home like a promise he never knew how to keep. It was Letty who cracked the ice again. On the 6th day, Rhys returned early from the south pasture, the sky bruised with a coming storm and the wind stiff with warning. He walked into the kitchen, pulling off his gloves, and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw her. Letty was sitting at the table, feet swinging, a crayon in her hand, a drawing half finished in front of her. She looked up and smiled without hesitation. "You're back," she said brightly. He stared at her without a word. She held up the paper. "It's our house," she said proudly. "I made you taller this time." There was a long pause, stretched thin by things unsaid. Then Rhys did something he hadn't done since she'd arrived. He walked forward, slow and uncertain, and sat, not beside her, not across, just near enough that the warmth of her presence touched him like sunlight through a curtain, close enough to see the crooked crayon lines and the loops where she had tried to spell her name, close enough to smell the lavender soap still clinging to her hair. She pushed the crayon across the table to him. "You can draw too," she offered with complete belief in his ability. He didn't take it, but he didn't leave either. That night, Leora found them in the parlor. Rhys was seated with a ledger open, though he wasn't reading it, and Letty lay curled beside him on the settee, her small body tucked into the corner of his coat like she trusted the stone to keep her warm. He looked up when Leora entered. "She fell asleep," he said simply. "I see that." "She came in with a picture," he added. "I told her I was working. She said she'd wait." "Was she in your way?" He shook his head quiet. "No." Leora stepped forward, voice lowered. "I can take her." He hesitated, then nodded, and gently lifted the child into his arms. His movements were careful, almost reverent. He cradled her like she was made of wind and glass, like any wrong motion might scatter her to the corners of the room. Light. "She's had hard winters," Leora replied. He nodded again, and without another word, carried her down the hallway like a man entrusted with something sacred. When Leora tucked Letty into the small cot in the hidden room and turned back toward the door, she found the hallway empty. Reese was gone, already part of the silence. The next morning she found an apple and a ribbon laid gently on the table, for Letty, and beside them, folded with deliberate care, was a letter addressed to Leora. Just her name, no wax seal, no signature. Inside was a single sentence written in an unsteady hand. "I never meant to want this." And outside, as the wind began to change, a carriage rolled toward Ashbourne Ranch, polished, perfect, drawn by white horses. It came just as the frost in Reese Ashbourne's chest had begun to thaw, just as a child's laughter had started to echo through a house long emptied of joy, just as Leora dared to believe that perhaps, not today but someday, he might reach for her hand instead of turning away. But the past never arrives quietly, and it never comes unarmed. It had a name, and it came to collect. The carriage doors opened like jaws. She stepped down onto the gravel in a gown of morning gray, trimmed in lace and expectation. Her posture was perfect, her chin high, and her gloves barely creased from the journey. Her name was Emmeline Fairhurst, and once upon a different life, she had been promised to Reese Ashbourne. Leora watched from the upstairs window, heart twisted into something cold and careful. Letty sat beside her, swinging her legs, unaware of the storm about to touch ground. Mrs. Talbot stood at the stove downstairs, stirring broth with deliberate force. "She's early," the housekeeper muttered. No letter, no warning, just showing up like a bad penny. Leora didn't answer. Because what answer could she give? She had no ring, no title, no claim, only a child with crayon drawings and a name that had never been written into a deed or prayer. Reese stood at the front steps, posture stiff as iron. He didn't offer a hand. Emmeline didn't need one. "Reese," she said, her voice like poured sugar over broken glass. "Emmeline, you look hardened. You look unchanged." She smiled, sharp. "A woman always remembers the man who ran." He didn't reply. She swept past him and into the house, her eyes scanning the foyer, the banisters, the polish on the floors. "It still smells of winter in here. Haven't you warmed it up yet?" "I'm not here to be warmed." "Oh, darling," she said, touching his arm like a secret. "You used to be." The house shifted around her like a body holding its breath. Leora kept Letty close, never letting her stray beyond the kitchen or the servant wing. But the child was curious, and children don't understand political air. On the third day of Emmeline's stay, it happened. Letty wandered into the main hall with a drawing in her hand. She meant to leave it on the Baron's desk, a surprise, a gift. She believed, as only a child could, that love was best given without warning. Emmeline found her first. "Well," she said, crouching like a cat, "aren't you a strange little thing?" Letty stared. "Do you live here?" Emmeline asked, sweet as spoiled milk. "I live with Mama." "And where is Mama?" "In the upstairs closet." Emmeline blinked, then smiled. "Well, that explains everything." The confrontation was quiet, which made it worse. Reese sat behind his desk. Leora stood before him, one hand protectively on Letty's shoulder. Emmeline lingered in the doorway like perfume you couldn't scrub off. "You lied," Reese said, the words a whisper. "Again. I was going to tell you." "When?" "When you looked at me like I was more than a contract." He closed his eyes. "She is more than me," Leora added. "She's the only thing in this world I didn't run from." Letty looked up at him, small and still. Reese stared at her, then stood and walked away, again. That night, Leora packed her things. Mrs. Talbot watched her fold the dresses slowly, like each one carried a different goodbye. "I told you," the old woman said. "Some men bleed slow." "I bled enough for both of us," Leora said, her voice flat. "Let her have the house. Let her keep the rooms and the fire and the name. I won't beg." She was halfway to the door when Letty ran back. The ribbon Reese had given her fluttered from her hand. "You said he was better than the others," she whispered. "I was wrong," Leora said. "No, Mama, you're just scared." Reese found the ribbon on the stairs. He found the empty cot. He found the drawing on his desk, the one with 3 figures now, not 2, one tall, one with curls, and one in between, holding both their hands. He sat in the chair and stared at it for a long time, until the candle burned low, and something inside him finally gave way. He found them at the edge of the ridge, where the prairie met the world. Leora was already climbing into the cart. He didn't shout. He just walked, and when she turned, something in her eyes cracked at the sight of him. "You made your choice," she said. "I did," he replied, "and it was the wrong one." She stared at him. He looked at Letty. "Do you still have your crayon?" The child nodded. "Good, because I'd like you to draw something new. A bigger house, one with 3 bedrooms, maybe a garden." Leora blinked. "What are you saying?" "I don't want her in a closet. I want her at the table. I want you in my study, arguing with me about books. I want my nights back. I want the noise and the mess and the surprises." He stepped closer. "I want the truth, and I want the 2 of you, all of you." She looked at him, stunned. "You don't know how to be loved," she whispered. "I'd like to learn," he said, "if you're still willing to teach me." She didn't cry. She just reached for his hand, and Letty took the other. Ashbourne Ranch changed after that, not overnight, not all at once, but there were flowers in the windows. There were books with childish drawings tucked between the pages. There were 3 plates at supper, and sometimes, just sometimes, there was laughter. Rhys still didn't like surprises, but he loved the 2 that found him anyway, and in the end, it was the smallest voice that rewrote the story he thought he'd already finished. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who have lost everything, and still open the door when love knocks quietly. Sometimes a child's hand is the only compass a broken man needs. This wasn't a tale of grand gestures or perfect promises. It was a story built from small things: a ribbon, a crayon drawing, a seat left open at the table, and the cold heart of a man who never wanted love until love wanted him. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that warmth can find its way into the darkest places, leave a word for Leora and Letty in the comments. And remember, the past can knock on your door, but only you can choose who stays.